Welcome to Deep Look, Ultiworld's weekly radio show about the current state of Ultimate. I am the host and the editor of Ultiworld, Charlie Eisenhood. Joining me is Keith Raynor, and Keith is forced to hold the microphone up to his mouth today. Keith, what's happening?
We have some technical issues with my more traditional fancy recording mic. So we're doing it TikTok style. For those of you watching the video, I mean, I feel like I look like the people holding the microphone on TikTok. So that's what my reference point for now.
Technical issues is one way of putting it. It's the mic is fried. Let's put it that way.
Well, it's crazy. Whatever the problem is, I can't hear it. So only you and the recording can hear it. But on my end, I don't even hear it. So for all I know, it's like a painful, ear-splitting, shrill sound, like, you know, in a science fiction movie that people are debilitated by, for all I know. But for me, it's nothing.
Well, Keith, I know you've got conferences coming up this weekend. We do. There's kind of some drama around conferences this year, huh? We've got B teams upset because they have to go to the dev conferences. I just saw somebody from UConn, I assume from the men's team, Keith, upset because they aren't going to be able to go to their standard conference because of some COVID policy thing that Yale sprung on them at the last minute. And then they're mad at USAU, even though USAU had nothing to do with it. There just seems to be like, is this just a vestige of people not knowing how to set up the conferences because it's been like 3 years since we've had normal conferences?
I imagine that's part of it, but I also imagine there aren't a lot of people setting up conferences, period. You know, USAU's probably got a dearth of volunteers. I'm sure if you went to the do you want to volunteer and help page, you would see the conference coordinators list just filled with please email here or whatever. So I imagine there's, you know, a lot falling on other volunteers or regional coordinators or even USAU employees that makes this complicated. And then on top of that, it's a strange year where, you know, it's maybe a little bit more unsure what teams will be in attendance. Dates are being decided really late, all that kind of stuff. I mean, and then even within the tournaments, you have super weird formats. Our tournament has a format that we've seen a little bit popping up, which is that like half hybrid pool bracket format. Like we have a 7-team tournament, 3 teams are in a pool, and 4 teams are in a bracket that like represents the second pool. And then the winner of the pool and the winner of the bracket will play in the final, kind of like they each won a pool, and everybody else will play continued pool play, where they play against the teams that they haven't played so far. And then that pool will decide the ordering of the teams. It's very strange.
Well, basically, USA Ultimate has changed the format manual, but actually has not published any actual changes to the format manual. And this was a big issue back at club regionals when formats were being announced, in some cases, like less than 24 hours before the tournament. And it was just a total nightmare because nobody could understand what was going on. They actually make a lot of sense. Basically, USAU is trying to reduce the number of required games to still get to sort of fair allocation of bids. And doing these sort of mini brackets is a sensible way of doing that. But as seems to be a continuing issue, like the lack of communication around this and the lack of clarity about like what these formats are going to be, or in the case of these B teams, you know, the fact that they have to go to this dev conferences, which, you know, at least in some regions was the case back in 2019. But, you know, it wasn't clarified in the guidelines that it was required. And so then some teams are like basically having their seasons get ended because they can't make changes with their university. And USAU is seeming to be very like intransigent about it, which I don't really understand that. Anyway, it sucks because everyone is trying hard to like get things back running again. But when the infrastructure is as fragmented as it is right now, and you're asking like 1 or 2 people in Colorado Springs to try to manage hundreds of conference tournaments around the country without a lot of external support from people locally, that's got to be brutal. And unfortunately, there's some teams that are going to get left in the lurch because of it.
I imagine I'm preaching to the choir mostly with our listeners, but like I know it's cool, especially on social media, to hate on USA Ultimate. Like, ooh, faceless corporation. Like, that's what people see. It's like 6 people, and they all care about Ultimate, and they're trying.
Yeah.
They don't always get it right. We can ask them to do better, but like, people just lay it on them. Like, oh, you're ruining my season. Blah blah blah. You're like like people act like they're being targeted or whatnot, and like, we can relax. It's okay to be passionate about your college career. We want everybody to be able to play, but it is a difficult situation to manage.
This is my issue, though, Keith. This is my issue. I agree with what you're saying, but on the other side, USA Ultimate needs to understand that the point of all of everything is that people are able to play.
Yes.
And if they are making decisions that are requiring teams not play because they're saying, well, no, you have to go to this conference, not this other conference, which you're probably going to finish in last place because you're a B team. Who cares? Like, I don't understand why it matters that much. I guess the reasoning would be that because of the size bids, teams, you don't want to count B teams towards the size bids for the D1 nationals teams. But fine, then just don't count them. There's no reason to count them if you don't want to count them. So don't count them, but let the B team play at the regular conference and just say, hey, our bad. We didn't communicate enough about this dev conferences thing. I just don't really understand why some of the decisions are being made the way they're being made. Because what you say is true. There are people, and it's a small number of people who are working really hard to try to manage everything. And everything is totally chaotic right now because of the pandemic. But why then make it hard for teams to actually just go out and compete? Because no one wants that. I don't understand.
And nobody deserves flexibility more and needs flexibility more than developmental teams. Like, I've spoken at length over the course of the past year about my concerns, especially in the college women's division, for program growth and, for desiccation to set in. And B teams by nature are going to be mostly new players, probably not have a lot of infrastructure. Like, they are the ones who A, we want to be encouraging to stay with the sport and we want to provide a good experience for her, but B, also need the help. So, like, we should be flexible. And the other thing is, when you're dealing with the universities, right, there's almost no flexibility there. Universities, club sports, student government, they're never going to be flexible. Like, our school has you got to tell them 6 weeks ahead if you want to get something paid for or whatever. So if you changed our conferences now, we would be in the lurch, but we'd try and figure it out. So you have to, USA Ultimate and the clubs themselves have to try and provide the flexibility, because you're not going to get it from the university. So I don't get me wrong. I do think that we want USA Ultimate to be able to provide these opportunities. And there's places where flexibility is warranted, even at the cost of competitive balance. I mean, we threw out the rankings this year. Like, competitive balance is clearly not the number one priority in this college season. And I'm not necessarily sure that it should be, especially when we're talking about developmental teams who tend to not upset competitive balance as is. But I definitely feel like there's a workable solution somewhere in here, but it kind of feels like we've already hit the zeros on the clock and it's too late to change the call.
Yeah, and it sort of frustrates me because the concept, first of all, of like having a developmental conferences, right? A B team conferences tournament that you send the B teams to go and play against each other makes a lot of sense, right? That's a more balanced playing field for most of those teams than to play at the regular conferences where they're probably going to get crushed. The thing is, if you're trying to make sudden exacting standards of like every B team must go to this tournament, even though we didn't really tell you that ahead of time, and it's not clarified in the paperwork anywhere, why then isn't there just like an, okay, FYI, next year, it's going to be required that you go to this dev conferences. That's where I kind of feel like I'm losing the plot a little bit. It's hard for me to understand exactly how many teams this is even affecting. I've talked to some regions where it doesn't seem to be an issue at all. But of course, there's been plenty of chatter on Twitter about this issue. But anyway, I just want to see people be able to go out and play. That's really what it comes down to for me. And on the other side of it, blaming USAU for everything is not the answer either. Like, if you did a bad job communicating with your university, sorry, that's not USAU's fault. All right. So Keith, are you excited for conferences?
I am. I hope it's not the end of our season, but we have that in our control. So we're spending the week getting the hype going, getting people ready for this tournament and talking about what it means to be there. But we're definitely excited. We've been playing in wind like all season, so I'm hoping that it's a little less windy. We've only played basically in Vineland, New Jersey, so it'll be our first non-Vineland tournament. So hopefully the conditions are a little more pleasant, because it's beautiful, right? We just had our first nice practice. It was like actually warm outside.
Did you play
People
yesterday?
People were last night. And it's beautiful in the Northeast. It is today too. So hopefully that kind of weather is what we'll be getting, because I would love some of that.
Love it. All right. So we are going to head into an interview right now with Matty Tsang, the head coach of the USA World Games team. And Matty's got a ton of interesting nuggets to offer about the process of picking the team, about the players that made the team, about how this USA national team program has developed over time. This is his third time now coaching the USA World Games team, and has obviously been coaching for many, many years in the club division with San Francisco Fury. So without further ado, we'll head into our interview with Matty. We'll be right back.
Welcome to Double Overtime,
UltiWorld's professional Ultimate League podcast.
your home for everything about the Premier Ultimate League and the Western Ultimate League.
And we're your hosts, Sasha Vogel and Jenna Weiner. On Double Overtime, we'll break down the weekend's games and give our picks for next week's winners.
We'll also give you our insight into league trends and share interviews with some of the biggest names in the game.
Also, become a subscriber to check out our subscriber-only bonus segment each week, where we'll give you a peek behind the curtain and offer our opinions on who has the best jersey designs, who'd make the best disc golfer, and so much more.
Double Overtime is available wherever you get your podcast and on UltiWorld's podcast page. Check it out before the clock hits zeros.
Joining us now on Deep Look is longtime Fury coach and now the World Games coach for the third time for the USA national team, Matty Tsang. Matty, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I feel like it's been years since I talked to you, which that can't be true, but it's definitely been years since you've been on the podcast. So first of all, how are you? Have you been able to successfully navigate through the pandemic times and come out on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, I've been very fortunate that family has stayed healthy and that we have a pretty robust community. So I no complaints here. I've been very, very lucky.
And now, we're getting back to a more full-fledged Ultimate schedule. How has the return to the field been for you?
It was nice to have last year. I felt like it was a transition year, and this is it's interesting. We're starting to go into club tryouts and trying to remember, we didn't really have a full club tryout last year. So trying to figure all that out again. So, I think it's coming back. I think it's like riding a bike, but maybe a little bit harder. But yeah, I'm excited to, kind of see where it goes, and still a little apprehensive. I think we're in a trough right now, and I'm fully, I work in a public school, so I'm very cognizant of daily, kind of the uptick in COVID. So I think we kind of still have to stay vigilant and ready for whatever is going to happen next.
Well, once again, very, very talented USA national team getting set to take the field at the World Games in a couple of months. You've done this now. This is your third time. So 2013, 2017, and now 2022 after it got delayed due to COVID. How has your thought process evolved around this part of the task, which is, picking the team? Because that's kind of the first step. And then, of course, you have to try to get everybody up and running and ready to go for the tournament in just a very short window of time, which is kind of its own battle. But in terms of picking the team, I know the process was different this year because of the double tryout and cutting straight to 14. But how has your process changed, the way that you look at it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where over time, like you get better and better at the process. And I think probably when I started out in 2013, this was the first time that we actually went to select teams. This was even before we did clubs in 2016. So, like we're brand new to it, Dutchie and I think it was just like, okay, we need to pick the best players. And I think it's slowly moved away from that. And I think, it's interesting, like from the outside, right, there's a lot of debate on who should make these teams. And I think what we realize is, especially for the World Games, it's such a specific context. And really it matters on how people play together and not really like what, we all know that they're good on their clubs. And so I think over the time through this process is understanding like what, pairs and trios of people look like together on the field makes a huge difference on whether you can reach your potential, with a couple of practices going into competition. So, I think I always realize that in kind of a philosophical way, but, going through this a couple of times and seeing like kind of the process of how quickly you have to come together, I really, realized that, yeah, it's all about combinations and how people, it's a specific skill set. Can you as a elite player play with a whole bunch of people who you've never played with before and in 3 practices get to your potential? And that's not everyone, and I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize. And that's why we have tryouts, right? Like otherwise we could just pick it on paper, right? Like you guys are experts at that. Like you see all the things, but like, honestly, like the tryouts actually matter a lot. And in some ways, like I'm glad to be here because I think a lot of times that's a black box for a lot of people because, most people don't get to be there. And I've been fortunate to be part of that process for, now 3 cycles here, but also with the WGC cycles as well.
For a lot of people, I think there's a lot of people who would say that making the team is in some ways harder than being successful once you're on the team. I mean, the team is so talented and, it is often going to be favorites in the matchups that you may be seeing at World Games, but getting through the gauntlet of these tryouts is a big challenge. When you're going through and designing the tryout process and creating what that gauntlet is going to look like, what factors are you using to make those decisions?
Well, I think for a World Games context, right, where there's only, 14 players in competition, there has to be a certain idea of what someone's overall skill set is, right? So what is a range of defense, right? Can they guard their position? Can they guard another position? Can they guard, small to big? Same thing for offense, right? Like, can they initiate? Can they continue? Can they play at the line of scrimmage? So there are some, like 1-on-1, 2-on-2 drills that you're going to try to see people's range within their skill set. And then honestly, there's a lot of like 5s and 7s because it is about the combinations, right? Like, can these 2 or 3 handlers work well together? And I think a lot of times people don't realize, right? Like if you look at like a ring reset and then a Boston Brute Squad reset, they're really different, right? And where they set up, even the starting positions, because they're trying to attack different parts of the field. And so when you see those 2 people together, yeah, they're great players, but they might not be able to play together. And his question is, over the tryout, can you adjust and figure it out? Like, can you talk with each other? And it's like, okay, where do you want me to be? Where are we going? And can you incorporate that? So, there is the skill set, right? But that we need to see in terms of range. Everyone's already been vetted, right, for World Games. Like, we already know they're good. They've made one of the national teams. And so it is, what's your range? Because it's a small roster. And then how do you work? How quickly over the tryout can you, from Saturday morning to Sunday afternoon, how quickly can you mesh with people, and can you mesh with a lot of different people over that course of that tryout?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I've actually never been personally to one of these tryouts for Worlds or World Games. It's something that I feel like I need to do, just like take the flight and come out.
I think you should try out next year, Charlie.
Maybe I should get into the game. Yeah,
we'll give you an auto invite.
Oh yeah,
you can embed.
You put a GoPro like on my head.
You gotta wear the GoPro. It's
people can ridicule me if I get destroyed by all these players. I would make a player too.
And then Keith will do a podcast analyzing.
I'd hit a shot or two. I could at least not totally embarrass myself out there. But anyway, I don't even really understand from a coaching perspective. You're looking at, you start with a 70-ish people, and you have to watch these people play for probably 15 total hours of time over a course of a weekend, and then make a ton of decisions. Like, how, I don't even really know where do you begin with that, because you can't really focus in, even in a sevens, in a 5 setting, let alone a 7 setting, on all of the people on the field at the same time. So are you looking for like certain things that tell you, I see you struggling in this one context, like that's a negative for you, or, I see you being successful in this one context, that's a positive for you? I just don't even know how you start with those kinds of decision makings without using your priors and like deciding on what about these players coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination, right? Like, I think that actually makes this process, very subjective. I think if you take 3 different coaches and go into this, you're going to end up with a different team. Like, I think for us to realize that, like, while we're doing, I think we're considering everything, like, this is a subjective process. Like, as coaches, we value certain things. We want to see certain systems, right? And so I think it is really difficult. I think one of the things well, first of all, like, what was super helpful at both of these tryouts is we had really good film. We filmed the whole thing, and we had really good angles. We were at Round Rock, and so very luckily, like, we had 2 cameras set up on both fields, and we had somebody who, downloaded the film on Saturday night. We could watch that go into Sunday. And so that was invaluable to us. Like, because again, with 70 especially, you miss a ton. And so it was really nice to pour over that footage and be able to see all the things that we missed. Because, a lot of things, like, honestly, like, when we're talking about people playing well together, there's subtle things, right? It's often the cuts that you don't take, right, that is informing, like, how well. And, like, we're used to watching highlights, and as coaches, we need to say, like, oh, that person in the Verstack looked behind them, started, and then saw something else and immediately cleared to another space. And that was really amazing, right? But that's not something that you actually see oftentimes, just with the naked eye. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, and this might be more particular to me, is like, I want to make the tryout really matter. And so what I do look at is, in the beginning, is like, who are the standouts? And who are the standouts over a course of, in this case, 4 days? And I think a lot of times that's not maybe the people that have the huge body of the work, right? Like, when we came, or it's not maybe what people expect sometimes. I think, when you look at the final roster, it's like, oh, well, these people must have done really well, and these people got added in toward the end. And what I really try to do with these tryouts is, your starting point is people who have high-level, consistent performance over the course of your tryout. And then that's the starting point, right? So, I think I'll use the example with the WGC cycle. I think if you look at the roster, people like see all these big names, but our top performer, one of our top 3 performers on the East Coast, was Aaron Schroeder. And one of our top performers on the West Coast, handlers, was Eva Pope. Probably if you looked at the roster, you wouldn't have picked those people out. But if you asked me, it was like, we came out of there, it was like, okay, Eva's going to be on this team. She's going to be one of our center handlers. How do we build around that? And so that's a similar thing with the World Games, is like, depending on the starting point, like Kayla Helton and Carolyn Normal on the women matching side had 4 days of really high level tryouts, and were able to perform what they do really well, worked really well with all the different players. And then, on the man matching side, Chris Kocher, Khalif, and Jack, had 4 really good days. And so that was kind of our starting point. So there's some aspect of that, like looking at like who is performing well, like can show their skill set, works well with others. And then from there, you got to fill out like role needs, defensive needs, and all of that. But yeah, I think it takes a lot. It takes kind of like the naked eye was popping up, depending on your co-coaches, and then actually looking at the film to build the team.
How much does Charlie have to shell out to get that footage? That's.
Well, players have all asked for it, but it's for internal use only.
Because our subscribers would probably be pretty excited to see that footage. But when you mentioned, with the national teams for the WGC, having a sense of like, okay, we want to build around this person. You have a short cycle, you have a small roster. How does the process work here? How much of it is like, okay, we know going in, we need to fill in these types of roles. Charlie and I, when we were making our projections for the team, we had players somewhat compared based on their skill set. So, you got to have your big or somebody who can match up with bigs that you're going to go against. You got to have your center handler. How much of it is already kind of predetermined? We need people in these roles versus, okay, here's what we're seeing at the tryouts. Let's create after we have the talent on the roster. What is the balance there?
I mean, I think it's different for different coaches, right? And so I think for me, because I do want to make again, like we're having tryouts for a reason. So my starting point generally is like, what are the handful of people who kind of pop up? And if they have a deserving tryout, like I feel like they should be on the team. And then from there, looking at what they offer, and then how do you fill in your other needs? I think specifically for a World Games scenario, right? You're going to have 14. We don't play O&D lines. Like if you look at our last cycle, we had 7 and 7, and they just went one after another. Like people, and the only person who plays 2 in a row is when the ratio changes. So with that, you basically have to look at your 7 and make sure that you are covered for every defensive matchup that's possible going into the World Games, which is a nuts with 7 players, right? So just taking the women matching side. So this would be exercise for Ultiworld. Like 7 women matching players. I need to cover Anushka Bodri on Canada. I need to cover Eliza on. I need to cover Kat Phillips. I need to cover the twins, Cardenas twins, and I have 7 players, right? And so that's where it becomes really interesting problem to figure out. So yes, we will compare bigs, right? Like, so on the man matching side, you have a certain number of bigs. And then from there, you got to figure out so the bigs can cover their position. Can they cover line of scrimmage, right? Am I going to take my big who can cover the best big on the other side, but suddenly I've got a squirrely Colombian player who plays line of scrimmage and then goes deep. Can my big also be able to do that, right? And so I think that's where it's a challenge, but also a really interesting problem. And so when you start looking at roster construction, that's what we're actually thinking about. And then on the offensive side too, right? Like with 14 players, in 2013, we went into playing Japan. So one of our biggest days, and Ashlyn Joy got food poisoning and Alex Snyder had migraines. So we were down 2, like, supreme, right? Like that was them in the prime of their time, and we had to make it work, right? And so I think that's for me through the experiences, like understanding like, oh, we need to have an answer for all of this, and like how can we do that? So right, it's not just like the specific role, like I need a big, I need a center handler, I need an initiate cutter, I need a fill. It's okay, like here's the full range. What happens if we have an injury? What happens if they have 2 bigs on the line? What happens, like the women bigs on Canada, Anisha Bodri is a handler, right? She's going to upline cut. Do we have somebody, like, if our big only can cover big cutters, we're kind of in trouble, right? And so I think that's one of the things that, when we're talking about expansive skill sets, that's what we're looking at.
I'm already getting excited thinking about the possible, matchups here. When you start to map out how you're going to run your offense and defensive sets, especially given that you don't have a lot of time to work on stuff, what's the plan? Because you already mentioned it. Players are coming from all kinds of different contexts with different, even within the same sort of basic offensive schemes, like let's say VertStack, there's different patterns, there's different approaches to that. So how do you build your O&D so that you can get up and running quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, we have to keep it pretty simple. I think the benefit that we have is that we have a really amazing player. So keeping a system that's pretty simple, that's easy to learn. It's interesting with all these national teams. I think their first practice offense always looks terrible. Like take an example from the past, like, we had revolver players who run side stack, and then we had some fury players who run host stack. And so when we ran Hostak, like Revolver players looked like the worst players in the world because they would clear across 4 lanes of traffic and just clog everything up. And then, like Fury players just like, where? What's going on? Like, where's the stack? So, it's one of those things where, yes, I think point very right, like phenomenal players, but if you play in a ring system compared to a sockeye system, like it's really different. And so, I would say same defensively, right? Like, I spent a lot of time watching Chicago, like Machines defense, but it's switch heavy, right? Like we're not going to bring that chemistry, or even in a mixed gender setting, is so different, right? And so the balance is to come up with a simple system and kind of teach that. And then within that, be flexible enough for like, okay, like Claire Chastain is doing this offensively. Like we need to make sure like she's getting these looks. Let's adjust our offense from there. So it's coming up with a simple system. And then within that, making room for individual players. And in some ways that's easy to do because we only have 7 players that we need to work with. And really like a lot of them are going to be on the same line. So, right. So as we work through, like they can build the chemistry. It's like, okay, we are going to switch in these situations. And this is how our language is going to, like, here's our common language on how we're going to do that or how we recognize these situations.
Real quick, I'm going to jump in ahead of Keith. The 2017 team obviously lost to Columbia. And it was kind of like soul searching time and a little touch and go. Obviously, you end up winning the gold. What did you learn from that team and that experience? And do you wish you'd made different decisions about personnel that year?
I mean, I think learning from that situation is that there has to be a healthy level of concern that even if you throw together really talented players, right, like you don't always have success. And I think a lot of times that's kind of the starting and stopping point for a lot of folks. It's like, yay, we threw together all-star team, it's going to be great. And I think to understand the humbleness is like, it's going to have to be a great team in order to reach our potential. So I think that's the first thing. I think in terms of personnel, like I think you could point to certain things that have made that easier, but at the same time, like the tryout was what the tryout was. And I, again, like the reason why we have tryouts is because how you perform there informs how you go on the team. So yes, there are people we left off the roster that if we used an algorithm, them at their ideal, they would get us out of a lot of trouble, but that's not what it was. And I think, this is what, for me, that's what coaching is wonderful. It's not an algorithm, right? We can run algorithms all the time, but upsets happens, crushes happen, close games happen, and it's a human endeavor. And so I think that's kind of where I find the kind of like joy is like figuring out like how do we as human beings who are fallible and also amazing, right, put this together in these high pressure situations. And so yes, like, could certain players have helped us last night? For sure. But that's not what the thing was. Like, it wasn't happening in the vacuum. But yeah, I think a lot of, starting, like, for me, like, learning from that experience and thinking a lot about, like, that first loss was pretty brutal. And we only had 3 hours to recover, and then play Canada. And if we hadn't won that game, we pretty much, our destiny was in our hands. We likely wouldn't have made the world.
It's pretty crazy that those were your starting games, like, from scheduling perspective.
Yeah, I don't know how they do it. It's round robin, but it seemed like we got two hard matchups right off the bat. So I don't know. It was like some random draw thing.
Do you feel like there's a lot of pressure? I mean, when you're touted as the most talented team, as the favorite or whatnot, everybody knows about the U.S.'s history of success and the U.S.'s position in the global ultimate scene, and like any misstep, can be construed as failure by some. Does that feel like a lot of pressure? Like you really have to bring your best all the time?
Well, I think the two sides are pressure or opportunity. And, obviously, like me personally, have been in this situation a bunch of times. And, for me, it feels like, you're fortunate to be in an opportunity to be one of those teams that has a potential to win a gold medal. And so for me, what it looks like is like, well, because there are a lot, like if, like I do this all the time in club, like there's some teams that they don't have a chance. And if you are one of the teams that have the chance, then what your commitment should be is like to understand, like you should honor your position. right? Because there's a lot of great players who don't have that opportunity. So I think for us, it's like embracing that and understanding like we have the ability to do this really special thing, and we should put in the time, the commitment, the openness to actually reach that potential. But yeah, for sure. Like, it's a different, I think as some younger players come into this position, it's a different place to be like, in some ways, like if you're one of the top teams, like there's a certain level of failure if you don't win, right? Like because you didn't reach your potential.
Yep. So how did you like this year's tryout process compared to the past where it was one weekend, cut to 20, then you have these weekends where everybody thinks they're going to make the team and then you still have to cut 6 people. Is this better?
Yeah, so much better. I mean, right, jury's still out because we haven't gone through the whole process, but it just feels a lot better. I mean, the way that we did it before, like, it was brutal, right? Because you spent all this time trying to build this team chemistry, and then halfway through it, you cut 6 people who aren't going to travel, and yet they're still practicing with you. And so those people feel really bad, right? Because they wanted this opportunity. The people who are left on the team are mourning because they have this strong connection. They feel bad for the people who aren't going to be continuing on with the journey. And so, yeah, I think Dutchie and I going through 2 times of that, like realized like, oh, we shouldn't do this again. And so, Dutchie was just like, yeah, next time around, like, let's have 2 tryouts and let's actually name the alternates from the beginning. So you kind of go in with that, into those practices with your eyes wide open, and it's a little bit easier to deal with. I don't think it takes care of all the disappointment. Like, our alternates for sure are disappointed not to make the 14, but my hope is it changes that overall dynamic and we're able to kind of build those bonds, with our 20 a little bit easier, and not kind of fracture our team chemistry, like, after 1 or 2 practices, which is, was personally just really, really hard for everyone.
Why isn't Dutchie coaching this year?
I mean, I think that's something you would have to talk with Dutchie about.
We've talked in the past couple episodes about the team, prior to as the rosters come out. And one of the things that Charlie and I both touched on is that historically the team hasn't had a ton of players who've had a lot of elite cross-gender play experience, who haven't been in that club scene a lot. And this year, Khalif El Salam, Sarah Meckstroth, and some of the other players on the team, like Carolyn Normile, do have a bit more of that experience in their background. When you went into the trial process, were you looking for players who were was there additional emphasis placed on finding players who were strong playing cross-gender than there was in other cycles? Or did it just kind of work out this way that those were the players that stood out this year?
I mean, I think kind of going back to your first question, what has changed over time? Like, I think for me, like understanding like the combinations and like trios and pairs of people working well together is so important to actually get to your finish point. And I think in the past, we didn't pay maybe as much as attention. Like we were kind of looking more as like individual, like they're really doing well, as opposed to the individual doing well in combination with 2 other people. And so what that happened was in our first practices, we spent a lot of time trying to like get people aligned, right? And one of the big wet ones is we have a lot of single gender players and getting people aligned, like how to play cross gender. So I don't think it was a point of emphasis like we need to look for mixed players, but it was a point of emphasis that we need people who can play mixed ultimate. For sure, that's one of the styles, right? But also we need people like, it could also be like 2 male matching players playing with each other with different, dump sets. Like you need to be like, can a pony player play with this other player, right? Like, and even hucking, right? Like sure, cross-gender hucking, right? Like for sure, like, Khalif came out and probably had the most consistent cross-gender hucking game. But also like Ring throws their hucks in a lot, like where their cuts are coming from and where they're throwing to is a lot different than it's on other like male matching teams, right? So like we also need to see that. So I don't think it's just, for sure, there's a mixed gender component, which a lot of people are not familiar with, but there's also just like stylistic differences. So for me, and for all the coaches is like, are they playing these positions well? Are they aware, right? Like I have this person going deep, it may be a woman matching player, it may be a male matching player. Am I making space so I take my defender where they actually have a one-on-one matchup? And, I think for people who play single gender, right, and used to switching and used to help, that's different. So for sure, like there's people who are more familiar with that format who are going to, shine.
There are always going to be trade-offs to be made, especially with a roster this small. What are the strengths of this team as you see them heading into practice weekends? And where do you see some potential areas of weakness that need to be addressed?
So I think, one of the strengths of this team, and, it is in terms of how we constructed it, is there's a lot of flexibility, right? Like there are some interchangeable parts. There's people who, play really well downfield as well as are comfortable in a handler set. I think we also have a lot of defensive flexibility. The challenge with flexibility is if you just have flexibility, you don't really have any structure, right? It's like, and so I think for us, figuring out where home base for people are and then where they flex into, right? And because I think we need very quickly to have something dependable. Like I need to look at my center handler and know that that person is there for the most part, most of the time. And then when it switches, that we actually doing it, not just improvising, that we're actually doing with the system. So I think it's two sides of the same coin. We have flexibility, but I think very quickly figuring out where people's roles are, where they stay home, where we can kind of like take our first punch, and then where we need to adjust and kind of, use our flexibility. So I think that's one of the, main challenges that we're going to be facing.
What are some of the other elements of the World Games specifically? You have these one game a day contacts spread out over the course of a week. You're playing against other small rosters. What other elements do you feel like are really important that make the World Games experience as a coach really unique and something you have to work to address?
I mean, I think it's the case with all international play, but especially in the World Games where it is like you don't have a lot of time to figure things out, but basically seeing a different style and being able to adjust pretty quickly in game. And I think it's heightened in the World Games because, this year is different because we actually have pool play, right? But you still have to be in the top two in order to, get to the finals. But yeah, I think there's that added aspect of it. And then, I think there's something, the World Games is a really unique event in terms of it's not an ultimate event. So there's this whole other, I don't know if it's a challenge, but it's something that's wonderful about it. It's like you get to, stay in an athlete's village and go to a dining hall with thousands of other athletes. And, I still have fond memory of seeing like the Cuban softball team, right? Like just sitting there and then like trying to figure, sitting in the hallway and just like figuring out like what sport do they play? Like the tug of war people are amazingly looking and then you shake their hands and they're calloused. And so it's, I think there's something that's wonderful about the magnitude of it. It does really feel more like the Olympics. And there's something also like there is a magnitude about it. Like, it seems like there's more riding on that experience. And so I think that's what I really love about the World Games.
Which teams are you looking at as the biggest challengers?
It's hard to say. It's really interesting going into this cycle, right? Because we didn't have a WUGC cycle. And so I feel pretty blind. I've started like doing some scouting, but it was like, the World Games was 5 years ago. It's kind of crazy, right, to think about. And yes, there's some of the same players. So I think, right now, like it's more focusing on the known quantities, right? Like we know the Colombians are still, right? There's enough footage of like the women playing in the in PUL, so we know they're still playing. I have no idea which Colombian men are going to be on there, right? Like that's really hard. But so in terms of known quantities, like we have to plan for Colombia because they're known quantity, right? Canada, like honestly, like some of those players we know about, but like we didn't see Sixers last cycle in the club, right? And so like I know how good they were in 19, but like they're probably a lot better. And so yeah, I'm thinking about Sixers. Germany was really interesting on the women's side. Like when we were, they were in a 2-year ramp up to WGC. So they actually came to the States. And so the way they were running their vert stack was pretty interesting. And so, yeah, you may say, oh, Germany, whatever. But like, unexpected style and something that you're not used to playing against is kind of scary. So for me, we've been planning for known things because that's what we know about. And then for me, I was like, there's a whole bunch of unknowns, and like scouting during tournament is going to be super important. And I'm glad that I have Miranda and Patrick there, two very smart people, to like, we can sit down and break down games and come up with game plans. And then for us in practice, thinking about like, okay, here's the 4 different kind of styles that we need to be ready for defensively. Let's actually prepare. So whatever comes up, like we're quickly able to make the adjustment. So not just playing against us, but like a Colombian style, a Canadian style, North American style. What do the Japanese look like? So on. So I would say I'm worried about everyone in a healthy way.
And I have to imagine you're going to prefer this year's format to what we had in 2017, since you had to play Colombia and Canada to start the tournament. And this year you get 1 game a day.
Yeah.
So a lot more time to prep, a lot more time to break down tape of the other teams. Is that accurate that you're going to prefer this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it enables you to have a little bit more time to, get all your ducks in a row, and, a slightly less, right? I think for us, where we do have less time to prepare than some teams, right? Some teams are on longer cycles, that it enables us to figure some stuff in tournament, and there's a little bit more of a cushion. So yeah, the pool play format, the 1 game a day, the ability to kind of sit and watch other games will be really important for us.
Are we going to see the team in action prior to the tournament, or are y'all planning to play anywhere? Are you aware?
Yeah, coming to a city near you. We're gonna be here in Oakland for our first practice in a couple of weeks, and then we're gonna go to New York City. Just decided this week, so we'll be out there May. So Charlie, if you want kind of just like a late tryout, we'll throw you on the field for a couple reps.
I was just gonna say, let's get together Team Multi-World. They can scrimmage us.
Yeah, I'll let someone on the team just pick. Like if I want to guard, I want to lock Charlie up. Like we'll
actually.
See, the thing is, the pressure is all on them. If I get open one time and I catch the disc, like also they lose their spot to me. That's the rules.
You can't match up with Charlie unless you subscribe. Like you have to be a subscriber to match up with Charlie. So
man, always marketing. Always marketing. Wow.
So New York City, just to make it easier for travel for the East Coast folks, is that the idea?
Yeah. Yes, because we have a number of folks on the East Coast.
And because you have half pony players on the team?
Yeah, we got a lot of pony players on the team. So we're going to go out there. Also, it's the ultimate media capital of the world. So we got to go there.
It certainly is.
And then we'll be at Poultry Days.
You're going to be at Poultry Days.
That's what I wanted to hear about. So we are going to see you.
Yeah, and then Noise and Hybrid, we've brought them out, and then Team Canada is going to be there. So we'll be in a power pool together on Saturday.
That's great.
And then drop into the brackets. So hopefully we'll get to, test our mettle against, some good teams.
I'm starting the camera planning now. We'll be there.
Yeah.
We'll be there.
Get your chicken. It's a good
I'm
time.
going to wear a chicken costume to film the tournament.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you been, Charlie?
I've never been to Poultry Days.
The chicken dinner's good. It's everything you hear.
I believe it. And it's going to be a crazy comeback year for Poultry Days. Like, everyone's going to go to Poultry Days this year.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great. Well, Matty, we'll have to connect off air about when you're going to be in New York, because
sure.
I might want to come out and check out a practice if it's open to the media.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to media. There's other people who have a say in that. You're going to have to jump through those hoops.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. We haven't really asked you about any roster decisions. Do you have any notes on just the roster decision process, on how you made the choices, some of the more difficult choices to make at the end? We all know who the alternates are, so presumably those were the last cuts for the most part. So what was that like this year?
I mean, it's interesting. I think, from the outside, people look at like, okay, top 14, top 20, and they're like, oh, that's 1 through 10. And I think one thing to realize is like there's still positional need, right? Like once you get to the roster, you're like, okay, we have 2 women matching handlers. If one of them goes down during this process for whatever injury, COVID, like we need to fill that spot, right? And There's also the same thing, like all the things I mentioned before. We lose this one player who guards 3 positions. We need to make sure we have an alternate who similarly fills that. So I think what ends up happening is there's quote unquote top 10 players who are left off our list, right? Like, and so I want to be like, and I think that's really hard because like there's people who performed really well that weren't even selected as alternates. And, I think that's hard for them, but it's also hard for people who are at the tryout, right? Like Claire Desmond, we all know how good she is. I especially know how good she is, right? She's not on that roster. Kelly Johnson, Vegas, played great 4 days, like offers so much we need, and I feel really bad for someone like that who checks almost everything that people who perform kind of like to their level, everything we can ask. And because it is a limited group and because of our starting points and because of the combinations, they're not on this team. And so what I would say to, in seriousness, and part that's really hard for me as a coach is like so much emphasis and worth is placed on these selections and all the conversations around the selections. And there's some phenomenal people who also performed phenomenally, right? There's people who are phenomenal and didn't perform as well at the tryouts, but there are also people who did everything that we as coaches could have asked for and are not in this group. And that's not on them, that's on us, right? And I think that's really important. And like, I have a lot of, we as the selection staff did a lot of care, and I think we checked, we did our job, but at the same time, that's on us. Like we made those decisions that had nothing to do with how deserving some of those folks were.
All right. Well, it's going to be a lot of fun to see this team come together, and good luck with the rest of this process. And we'll see you in Birmingham, Alabama in the steamy July summer.
Yeah, get ready. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Matty Tsang with us here on Deep Look. Appreciate you giving us some time, and we'll talk to you again soon. Welcome back to Deep Look. Well, Matty, a fascinating interview as always, Keith. I appreciate how forthcoming he is about the decisions that have to get made and how to put the team together and thoughts on past years and what was working and what wasn't. What stood out to you?
Well, Matty's so thoughtful, and talking to him about this process, you can see how unique it is. I mean, it's a coaching experience unlike pretty much any other. So it's fascinating to hear about what goes into evolving that and hearing how his process has evolved over his time doing this. And while we talk about, wanting to get other coaches in the door, and I still think they should, especially in, kind of assistant coaching roles or whatnot, although from talking to the coaches, it sounds like the responsibilities are generally pretty well distributed and the head and assistant coaching roles are mostly titles. But having someone like Matty who's been there before, who can help guide, like having him there over an extended period of time allows him to see how that process should evolve and gets us to where we are today a little bit with the way that the tryouts were run, what kind of things they're emphasizing, how they're looking to challenge players. And hearing Matty talk about that was very insightful.
Certainly. I think what I found particularly interesting is kind of talking about the actual approach to team construction. The idea of building around particular players who've played so well at tryouts that that you're going to take them. And then you think, okay, well, now what do we do next? That's interesting because you could look at it from different ways. I mean, you could imagine that you come in and you say to yourself, well, we need to have, female handler, male handler, female mid, male mid, et cetera, and then look to fill each of those slots with the best available player at the position.
Like a fantasy draft.
Like a fantasy draft. But it makes a lot of sense that that's not how you would do it, especially given the some of the things that they've learned from the past when it comes down to wanting to see players who play well together. I thought that was a very interesting part of the way they looked at things this year. It's not at all obvious to me that that's how I would consider it if I was just, plugged in as the head coach, but it makes sense. I mean, you need having some continuity is important because how many opportunities does a team really have to gel before meaningful competitive games?
And it's fun for us to prognosticate. We'll continue to do it. People tend to treat these things like a treatise on what the best player is, who the best player is, like like player rankings. And we all know that team construction is not that simple. But I think it's clear from talking to Matty that it's even more focused on how the team fits together than it is on overall ability or overall talent or something like that. So I think we can get further and further away from that. It's harder for us, though, to make a clear assessment on that when we're, just kind of putting out our picks for who's going to make it. We're not at tryouts. We don't see how teammates play together or how people adapt to the new situations. I did find that there was kind of a curious tension in the way that you're building a team. So when you're looking for players who play well together, on the one hand, that's going to favor players who play in elite programs together for an extended period of time. So obviously, the two most obvious examples right now are Pony and Fury, right? If you're on one of those programs, you're playing with a lot of elite players who have a chance at being at a tryout like this. So first off, your good teammates need to be there, right? So that you can play well with them. Playing with lots of good players is really going to help you do that. And then once they're there, you have to be in a position to showcase what you can do together. On the other hand, you have kind of this other tension where by playing with the same people and playing in the same system so frequently, you might not get the adaptability you need to be able to partner with other people or integrate with other top-level players. If you're playing with Fury or Pony, or I know people have been talking about where are the North Carolina players. Well, a lot of those players have been playing the same systems together for like 10 years. How adaptable are those players when they're put in other environments? If you don't have a pair or a trio of them to like build off their chemistry, like are they at a disadvantage at that point? So that same thing could happen to a Fury or a Pony or another program that's very strong that brings a couple of different players to that environment. If they've all played the same way with the same people for a long period of time, that could hinder their ability to become a part of a greater whole on a team like this. So I think there's an interesting tension there between those two things.
The note that I want to put out there is that Pony, Fury, these are programs that are often built by players coming in from out of town. These are hub cities for work, and it's not so long ago that Pony was bad, that like they missed nationals regularly. And now they're, championship level team. But that's not because of a bunch of influx of people who played their whole life in New York City. Quite the opposite. Now, San Francisco, you've got a lot of California players, but from all around California, Southern California, Northern California, people who played in various college programs. Also, the college depth out there is crazy. The coaches out there are amazing. The different thing about North Carolina is that a lot of those players are homegrown. The bulk of their teams are homegrown players, people who have played in North Carolina maybe since they were a kid or at least in college. Now, that's not entirely true, of course, but it's not Raleigh-Durham is not a hub location for work the same way that New York and San Francisco are. Now, that doesn't make it bad, but it could mean that those players are less sort of exposed to broader communities of Ultimate, right? So, you think about Jimmy Mickle, for example. He played in Denver and in Colorado for a long time, and then Australia, and then, ends up in New York. And you could do this exercise for any number of players. But the point is that, like, if you're very, very accustomed to doing a thing a certain way, because especially in North Carolina, there's sort of strategic balance and thought all the way down from the top level all the way down to the high school level, because you got the same coaching like philosophies that have been set by Mike DeNardis all these years. And so players are going to be very much set in the way that they do those certain things. And if that's not working at the USA national team tryout, maybe that's an issue.
Maybe there's some critical mass that North Carolina achieves where like they have so many good players at tryouts that it's just like, well, their style is the style we should play. Like, let's let them drive the bus
Right.
and find people who fit into that. I could see that happening. I mean, if Phoenix and Ring win back-to-back club titles or whatnot, and all the good players are coming out of North Carolina, then you're talking about a different situation.
And think about who your coaching staff is too. That's going to have a lot to do with it. If you have somebody from North Carolina on the coaching staff, I bet we end up with more North Carolina players on the team. Just saying.
It's true, and it's interesting because obviously you could say that about Matty and Fury, but Fury's also been the strongest program in the women's club division in its history. So it makes sense that you're seeing a lot of players from Fury. I mean, we talk about the same thing when we talk about Seattle players at the youth level, right? Like, yes, there are a lot of them on international youth teams, on top level youth teams, but they're also producing the best youth players in the country on balance for the most part. So as that balance of power has shifted over time, but we'll continue to see that kind of thing playing out. I think.
I'll also say this about the North Carolina thing as one final thought. Jack Williams was the only player from the North Carolina scene that I really felt was like a lock to make the team.
Agreed.
So there you go. You know,
I mean, North Carolina is being driven a lot by young players. I mean, you think about
and depth.
This 2021 being the year of North Carolina. I mean, half of that year is won by college players. You know, like Anders Youngst and Liam Searles-Bowes. Those are great players, but they're probably a couple years away from being ready to make a World Games team. So it could be very North Carolina heavy a couple years from now when Dawn Colton and Bridget Meisner and a healthy Ann Worth are back. It opens up a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I think we will see more representation in the future, no doubt. All right, let's turn our attention to a little bit of small ball. It's time to play some small ball. Keith, take it away.
Got a lot of bit of small ball, Charlie. There's just a lot. I guess North Carolina style. We got a lot of small ball here to play. So let's start with the news out of TEP. So the AUDL is basically partnering with TEP, the major event held in Medellin, Colombia. They are hosting what they call AUDL Sky. So they're doing a series of showcase games. This also includes the Premier Ultimate League, who will be playing a regular season game. The only of these games that will count towards some larger structure will be the opener, the PUL game, the Revo Pro's only home game of the season against the visiting Milwaukee Monarchs. Then there's a World Games scrimmage where the Colombian World Games team will be playing against a group of American All-Stars. So I imagine that'll be half PUL players and half AUDL players or something like that. And then there are 2 AUDL preseason games taking place. The Los Angeles Aviators are playing a Latin American All-Star team, and then the Empire are playing the Breeze in 2 back-to-back preseason games. So an interesting schedule and interesting integration to see the AUDL reaching out into the Latin American market.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is something that they want to do, make a push towards trying to get more interest from the Colombians and perhaps beyond in Latin America. They're sending Luke Johnson down there to broadcast games and like doing a whole thing here. So I'm curious to watch the games, tell you that much. I definitely want to watch the Colombian World Games team. And it should be fun to see. I mean, it's a very cool tournament. Like TEP is like one of the most important tournament in the Americas. Like it's long drawn top American club teams and players down there, and have heard just great things. Our reporter Daniel Prentice was there. I think, when was that? Was that last year? 3 years ago? I don't remember when it was. A few years ago, pre-pandemic, presumably. And reported on the event, and it seems like just like a great fun, great competition, and this seems to be extending that. Whether there's actual value to the AUDL to kind of like have a lot of audience in Colombia, I don't know, but I think it's cool.
And a good chance to experiment. I'm sure it has some cost, but probably not an exorbitant cost to help make this happen. And they'll be able to put content into the AUDL TV platform. I'm with you. The thing that I want to see the most is the Colombian World Games team.
Sure.
I want to see what that team has to offer. I want to see what Elizabeth Mosquera looks like coming back from injury. I want to see what the male matching side of their team looks like. And then, obviously I want to see the Monarchs and Revo Pro. Neither of those teams has ever lost a PUL game. So somebody's coming home with the first L.
You taking Revo?
You got to on home turf, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that we count against them is the travel, and now it's the Monarchs doing a bunch of travel. Like, there's no way Milwaukee's taking their full team, right? Like, there's just no chance.
Well, and this gets us into our second segment here in our small ball, which is the playoff structure for the PUL. And it makes this game, I think, extra important for Revo to win. I mean, I think they're clearly the favorite. They're probably 5-point favorites. But the league has been split into 3 quasi divisions. There's not necessarily games between all of the teams within these divisions, so it's not like a traditional division in the sense of other pro sports. But you have the Midwest, which is Minnesota, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Columbus. You have the East, which is DC, New York, Portland, and Revo. And you have the South, which is Raleigh, Atlanta, Nashville, and Austin. Now, one team from each of these divisions will make the championship weekend. And then the best second place team from one of the divisions, as determined by the USAU algorithm that was used in 2019, will get the fourth and final spot at the championship weekend. And so if you take a look again at that East Division, Keith, DC, New York, Portland, and Revo, I mean, that is a stacked division compared to the other two. And at least 2 of those teams will not make the playoffs, guaranteed.
A real shame that we may not be able to see some of those teams. I mean, we think that could be, I mean, theoretically, that could be 3, maybe even, I mean, if you're really rosy on Portland, like, there's a way you could construe that this is, nah, you can't. I don't think you could really say Raleigh's not a top 4 team. I can't even get that far. But this is at least 3 of the best 5 teams in the league, probably, and maybe 4 of the best 6.
Yeah, and you're basically guaranteeing that let's be honest, a weaker Midwest team is going to make the playoffs over one of DC, New York, and Revo.
I'm not sure that I buy that. I mean, Milwaukee could easily be better than the second best East team.
You think they're? I don't think I can buy it. Maybe I could say they're better than New York. After the DC Raleigh game we saw this weekend, the Shadow are clearly very, very good. Revo is defending champions, clearly very, very good. You know, with them, those 2 plus Raleigh, I think that's your top 3 in the league. Maybe you could convince me that Milwaukee could be ahead of New York, but I'm not sure I buy it.
If Milwaukee goes out and beats Revo, I don't know, to 20-17.
I'll obviously change my mind about that.
I do think we tend to overestimate our ability to know exactly which teams are going to be the good ones, especially when we have way less information than a typical season that we're going into. I mean, these teams haven't played in a long time. I get that this structure has some issues. It's not necessarily the most competitively balanced format, but let's not forget in 2019, they gave a team an auto bid.
That's true.
So it's better than that. And you know what? Championship weekend was still fire. So
that is true.
We still should end up with a good championship weekend. I think there are probably more than 4 good teams, 4 teams that will feel like deserving playoff level teams. So somebody's going to get left home anyway. It is the thing that does rub me the wrong way is that the teams don't all play each other. Like, there's not a balanced schedule where you see all the teams in your division. So you are going to be a little bit at the behest of your schedule in some ways. And a 6-game schedule is not a great amount of data to feed into the algorithm for the wild card component. So I have some issues with that, but like, ultimately, the teams that go out there and win their games are going to be in a position to make the playoffs, and that's what it's all about.
Fair enough. Keith, we've also got some new club guidelines out, and people have been waiting to see what the schedule is going to be for the 2022 season, and we've also got the rules. So let's just break it down really quick. The schedule is very much like it's been for the last few years. No real significant changes. Pro League Challenge, second weekend in July in Colorado. You got the Select Flight East and West in Virginia and California later in July. U.S. Open back in Minnesota early August. Then we've got the Elite Select Challenge in the Midwest, Indianapolis in mid-August, August 20th. And then the Pro Championships are going to be in Raleigh, North Carolina this year over Labor Day weekend. and then on towards the national championships in San Diego starting October 20th. So the big notes beyond that, rankings are back. So we will have rankings that determine bids. No teams are required to go to any tournaments this year. So that matches what we saw in 2021. And everybody will have to play sectionals as a result. Roster flexibility is still in place. You can switch teams a bunch until early July. And then your bid priority into these top TCT events is determined by either your 2019 or 2021 performance. So they gave elite flight teams and pro flight teams from 2019 the top priority, and then 2021 qualifiers for those flights, and then everybody else. So pretty clever way of allowing 2019 to still be the thing that counts, like they told us that it would, but still acknowledging that 2021 happened and giving those teams a chance to get into these bigger events.
And that felt like something of a loose end from the club season, was how are you going to decide flights and what status you're in. So good for them to be able to tie that one up in a way that makes sense. Looking at this, how many of these changes feel like they could be headed for a long-term situation?
That's a good question.
Running some of these back for a second year makes me think that USA Ultimate could be thinking about making some shifts.
Well, I think that the tournament flexibility and not requiring certain tournaments, like, are we going to just see that become a standard procedure? It had some downsides last year, but things were a little different last year. Like, some teams just didn't really even get their season started until late August. In some cases, even not until the postseason. So what happened is that we had, if you go back to US Open, right, there was a very competitive men's division, and there was basically maybe there was no women's or mixed division. I think there may have been none, or it was not competitive. So some teams were choosing to travel to these events and others were not. That, will we see that same effect again? I think it'll probably be better than that, but we'll probably see more regional based play. So, Midwest teams are probably going to go to US Open, but maybe the Seattle teams don't fly in for it. I think it's possible. Teams have long complained about the rigidity in some cases of the scheduling, and this certainly removes that entirely. And it's not like it completely broke down last year, and teams still want to play the best teams, and the way to play the best teams is to go to one of these events.
The USAU hopes. You certainly, I think part of the reason that they like being able to require is that it keeps some of the control in their hands. If some other tournament springs up that's attracting a lot of elite talent, then that, what do we have? The Philly, what do they call it? The AMP invite or something? The Philly, I don't know what they called it last year, but if a tournament like that pops up and takes away a lot of the elite mixed talent from the US Open, like, USAU is not going to like that. But on the other hand, the other thing is that it's easier for teams to plan where they know where the good teams are going to be already. It's a lot harder when you're emailing other teams, you're asking around who's gonna be where, like trying to plan your flights or whatnot for tournaments you want to travel for. I do think you're going to see a bit of a wavering of the level of competition at some of these tournaments. So you could see some situations where you have fewer good teams at major events, and their appearances are a bit more scattered around. But I do think that this is what people want. I feel like people have been saying this for a while. They want less requirements. They want to play in sectionals again, even though I think once elite club teams start doing that again, they're going to be like, wait, never mind. We don't like it. But there's been all this. We don't see all our local teams. It's bad for development. It's particularly hurting the women's division where they have less teams. So sectionals have been kind of ugly because there's so few teams there. So all those things could continue to help. And I honestly think people responded well to the roster flexibility even last year. It's easier for tryout stuff. So I think we may see some of that continue as well. I really think that it feels like USAU is really trying this stuff on.
Do you see other things here that you think are going to be sticky?
Those are the main ones. Obviously, the mixed prescribed ratio rule feels like another one that they're going to change away from the end zone decides rule that they've been using. This seems like a traditional step that they're going to have, one where it's just changing every couple of points by mandate.
Yeah, I think the one thing we didn't talk about yet is that they're going to also be at the most competitive tournaments introducing the mixed prescribed ratio rule. So instead of the team pulling or receiving the pull in a particular end zone getting to decide the gender ratio, it will be predetermined at the beginning of the game, and you'll play 2 points, with one ratio and then 2 points with the other throughout the entire game. This is where international ultimate is heading. It's what we're going to have at the World Games, and USAU explicitly said that they're planning to transition towards this for all mixed tournaments going forward, and this is kind of like a step in that direction.
I don't play in the competitive mixed division. I haven't coached in the competitive mixed division, so I can't say, specifically that I feel like this rule is better, but it seems so much cleaner, so much easier to plan your subbing around. No more of like people having to make hand signals across the field and like, oh, we have too many of the wrong people on for this point. Like that stuff's messy and it just causes problems to me, especially from like a broadcast standpoint. Much easier for everybody to just know, hey, this is what the ratios are going to be. This point, this point, this point, this point. Let's plan accordingly. Charlie, let's head back to the semi-pro leagues to talk a little about what was a instant classic in the Premier Ultimate League between Raleigh Radiance and DC Shadow, two teams that we talked about earlier as being two of the top teams in the league, and they put on a show playing against each other in Raleigh in the home opener for Raleigh and DC's season opener. Raleigh gets the win in a really close game. The final score was 17-16. It was, I don't think anybody ever led by more than 2, and most of the time it was 1. DC had a chance to tie the game in the final 2 minutes or so, couldn't convert, and Raleigh's able to hold on and play their way out. But there's so many storylines between these two teams. You have their matchups in the East Championship Series in 2021, which was a really great matchup. You have the players who've changed teams. Like Sarah Mextroth was on DC last time they played. Now she's playing with Raleigh. You have all the World Games players on the two different teams between World Games players and alternates. I mean, there's a lot to go over, and it was just a really high level, exciting game, which is kind of what we expected out of these two teams that we projected to be 2 of the top 4 teams in the league.
Can we just go ahead and schedule these teams to play in the postseason? I mean, I don't know if they're going to play in semis or they're going to play in the final, but it would not shock me at all if we saw these two teams face off again. I hope we get it. Look, I mean, is it any surprise? These are deep teams that have some of the literal best players in the country on their rosters. And this is the kind of game that you want to be able to highlight as the best that we've got. I feel like we don't get games this good in the club season all that often. And I think it's partly because club teams tend to distribute talent a little bit more, and the club division tends to distribute talent a little bit more. Than these teams are sort of reconcentrating talent into these hub teams. But I also think just the setup of the season and the way that, one game counts for a lot in a way that it doesn't in the club season, just a spectacular game. There's nothing else to say about it. This, I can't wait for the rematch.
Absolutely. I mean, you had some really tremendous performances on both sides. Lindsay Sue played really well for Radiance. So did Sarah Mextroth, to be expected from both of them. There were some crazy blocks. Sue had a huge block on the sideline. We didn't exactly the best camera angle on it, but they really got up in the air for a shoulder high block early on in the game. Cammie Groom on the other side, bit quiet until really started to come on in the second half, had a crazy run in the fourth quarter. We have a new podcast, the Double Overtime podcast, that's going to cover Western Ultimate League and Premier Ultimate League play. And they tweeted from their account, which you should follow, at Double OT Pod. And they tweeted out the clip of Cammie Groom just taking over defensively for a point, just getting these 2 crazy run-through blocks and then sprinting for bookends in the fourth quarter. Exciting. Carolyn Normile was also awesome for DC, maybe the best player in the game, in my opinion. So this was a high-level game, a lot of stars in the league, and I hope that the league continues to promote this game because it's a great way to kick off the season and get people excited about what else you'll have to offer.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think the way that Carolyn played, like, you're like, okay, I see why she made the World Games team. Yeah, I will say, the presentation could be better. Like the broadcast was a little clunky. There's like people just sort of sitting in chairs on the sideline. It looked like a club game. I would like to see effort put in to make the game as presentable as possible in order to showcase the level of the game at the level that we want, semi-professional Ultimate to look like. That said, I think that the quality of the contest spoke for itself. And these could be the two best teams in the league, Keith.
You love to see playoff level Ultimate in the second week of the season.
You do.
So
you definitely do.
I hope that we get more of it. I mean, we have, like I said, two really good teams playing at TEP this weekend. So hopefully they continue the run. I want to pivot over to the Western Ultimate League, just kind of check in with where things are because they're like halfway through the season already.
It's quick.
And we're coming up on a big weekend. So they're going to have a mini tournament weekend this weekend. So there are 4 games, I want to say, 3 of which are at the mini tournament event. So we're starting to get into the nitty gritty of who's going to make the playoffs this season. So yeah, there are 3 games at San Diego, 2 of which include the host team, the Super Bloom, and it'll be LA and Arizona who are visiting. And then there's also a 4th game in Seattle, San Francisco visiting Seattle. But right now, you look at where the standings are, Seattle in the commanding position at the top of the bracket. LA gets a crucial win, keeps any hope for making the postseason alive when they beat Utah last week in LA. So, if they go out and win both of these games this weekend, then maybe there's hope for them. I don't think anybody's truly eliminated. San Francisco and LA are in really difficult positions right now. If you have 1 win or less, you're really could be in a tough spot. But, I think Seattle, Oregon, they're looking pretty secure. That means that there are 2 playoff spots left for everybody else to fight for, assuming that Seattle and Oregon continue to hold on. So they've looked like very strong, the Northwest teams, and it'll be a battle for the rest of the league. It should be pretty entertaining to see how it shakes out, especially with this weekend and next weekend, both being mini tournament weekends with 4 games apiece.
Yeah, I mean, there's only 2 teams over 500 right now. Yeah, Seattle and Oregon. Arizona's 2-2. San Diego's 1-1. Everybody else has a losing record. Tough loss for Utah at LA. And it was kind of, some of it was out of their hands. They had some players missing because of canceled flights and issues like that. 3 of their top 7 players not there. But you got to be able to dig deep in that spot and get a win. Obviously huge for LA. And that, if you lose there, I think LA season's basically over. But now very much in the hunt. And if any team can go 2-0 at the San Diego weekend coming up, then they put themselves in a great position to get a playoff spot. So we'll see what happens. Then, not this coming weekend, but the following, there's 4 games happening in Utah. So Utah gets its home games. But they're still very much in the hunt. If they can end up going 4-2, obviously you're going to have a great chance. I think we're definitely going to have teams with 3 losses get into the postseason. So maybe just 1. Depends on how things shake out. But certainly with only 6 games on the schedule, you really need to get those W's. And a lot of teams are facing kind of do or die situations this weekend.
And that was LA. I think their only home game of the entire season. Road teams have won a single game so far this season.
That tells you what you need to know about how hard it is to win on the road.
And now there are some neutral site games thrown in there, and LA will be playing 1 neutral site game this weekend. So they'll play a neutral site game and a road game, but it's tough. I mean, they have 3 games left. 1 of them's neutral site, 2 are road games. So they're going to have to buck the trend. And that's going to be true for a bunch of these teams that are going to need wins when the home teams have been really benefiting from the home cooking, from the home crowds, I guess. If you're a fan, this should be hype because you're like, oh wow, we're really helping our team win. I want to make sure I'm at the game so that our team can get the W. Because road teams are struggling right
I was
now.
going to say this. I feel very vindicated about Oregon from our preseason discussions, but I was terribly wrong about LA. Hey, they got the win over Utah. We'll see what happens, but I'm skeptical they're going to make the playoffs. Just the combination of scheduling and they've looked weak in some games. They have the worst point diff in the league.
It's still been pretty balanced
As we expected.
Aside from Seattle, who has like a plus 24 point differential or something. I mean, they part of that's inflated. They had one game where they went 27-13 or something, blew them out. So Seattle pushed up their point diff, but make no mistake about it, they're the only undefeated team. They have a big point diff. They are the favorite and have been dominant. But other than that, everybody else has been very competitive. So it really has a kind of any given Sunday sort of feel. Should make the postseason extra interesting too.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for this edition of Deep Look. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you join us for our subscriber-only bonus segment. You can become a subscriber at ultiworld.com/subscribe. It's less than $4 a month. And we're going to be catching up on some reactions to our Extreme Makeover Ultimate Edition episode. We got some really insightful emails and want to talk through some of the topics that came in, and so we will do that in the sub bonus. For Keith Raynor, I'm Charlie Eisenhood saying so long, and we'll talk to you next week right here on Deep Look.